New exclusive CNN reporting about highly classified intelligence that went missing at the end of the Trump administration. The intelligence was related to Russian election interference in the United States. It was so secret, it was kept inside a safe within another safe at CIA headquarters. But in the final weeks of the Trump administration, a copy of that intelligence was put inside a binder brought to the White House as part of an effort to declassify documents related to the FBI's Russia probe. And from there, the trail goes cold. Our Katie Bolillis helped report out all of this, and she joins us this morning. Why is this significant to the American people?
So this binder that was brought to the White House contained raw intelligence that the U.S. and its NATO allies collected on Russia's efforts to meddle in the 2016 election, including sources and methods, which are some of the most sensitive information in the intelligence world. So what we're talking about here is the underlying intelligence that formed the basis of the U.S. government's assessment that Russian President Vladimir Putin sought to help Trump win the 2016 election. And the disappearance of this binder was so alarming to intelligence officials that, according to our sources, they briefed Senate Intelligence Committee leadership about the situation last year. Now, we're told by one U.S. official familiar with the matter that this was not among the classified items that were found in last year's search of Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort, and it wasn't why the FBI searched Trump's residence. But what is true is that more than 2 years after it went missing, this intelligence still does not appear to have been found.
I am so fascinated by this story, and also how the intelligence ended up at the White House.
Yeah, so Trump had spent years trying to declassify material that he said would prove his claims that the Russia investigation was a hoax. And this intelligence was part of a massive collection of documents that he ordered brought to the White House. And there was this sort of frantic scramble in the final days of the administration to redact the documents so that they could be declassified and released publicly. On his last full day as president, Trump did issue a declassification order for these materials, but they didn't get released before he left office. And there's actually a Trump ally who has filed suit over this, hoping to force the federal government's hand. And we, in reporting this story, CNN spoke to more than a dozen sources, my colleagues and I, who all of whom described sort of how this intelligence was brought to the White House in the final weeks of Trump's presidency and then went missing.
And our opening clip was CNN on their breaking news that Trump deliberately leaked highly sensitive intelligence into how Russia helped him come to power, revealing confidential methods U.S. intelligence uses to collect information to protect our country from foreign adversaries. This is the same crime that got Reality Winner locked up. So when Reality Winner, an NSA contractor, leaked documents to The Intercept to basically say, hey, Intercept, stop making light of Russia's attack on our democracy. The election hacking that Russia did was real. It was more widely done than the public knows. And here's some leaked documents from the NSA to prove it. And part of the issue, the crime that the prosecution, the case of the prosecution against Reality Winner, American Patriot, whistleblower, one of the cases held against her was that the documentation, the confidential docs that she shared with journalists that she thought she could trust, was that it showed methods of collection. It showed how U.S. intelligence was able to detect the Russians and how that itself is very sensitive. And by revealing that information, the Russians would then know how to better hide from our detection systems. So here you have Trump doing what Reality Winner got arrested for, and he's still walking around free and running for president and is the front runner in this election. So I want everyone to understand how deeply disturbing this is. Once again, this is not normal. No, it's not normal. And that this is very much an atrocious, huge, destructive national security threat of a leak, a bomb that Trump himself set off against America's own national security, on par with taking all of those highly classified documents and stacking them in bathrooms and ballrooms in the Viper's Den, a foreign adversary spy magnet known as Mar-a-Lago, where Chinese and Russian spies have been known to hang out, just pouncing on opportunities like this. And part of those national security secrets, including America's nuclear secrets at a time when Russia is continuing to threaten us and our allies like Ukraine with nuclear warfare. So yeah, That's how big of a story this is. That's why I wanted to include it. And just to remind people that this is America's nightmare. It's not over. As I've long told people on the show, we're going to be living with the fallout of Trump for many, many years to come. Okay. Now, Terrell joins me in this special bonus episode because we have a lot to say on a historic time for Ukraine. I know the news is very grim. There's news that Ukraine's ammunition is slowing down, that they're not getting enough of the aid that they need, and that's having a real effect, that the U.S. was micromanaging their counteroffensive and being far more conservative than Ukrainians wanted to be, and how that slowed things down for Ukraine, and that Ukraine is being pressured by the usual status quo thinking of America's inside the Beltway foreign policy establishment to come to the table, negotiate with Russia, thinking that Russia's, had enough. But Russia will, under Putin, will simply never negotiate. There've been so many attempts over the course of this war, and Putin himself, in a very lengthy annual address to his nation, doubled down and said they're not going to stop in Ukraine until their aims are met. And their aims are still denazifying the country. Never mind, it has a Jewish president. But I do want to list some interesting developments. And Terrell, just jump in when I'll just mention this first one. Germany's Olaf Scholz told Hungary's Viktor Orban to leave the room so that European Union leaders could have a unanimous decision on Ukraine finally moving towards EU membership. Orban left the room and the vote was passed. And now Ukraine finally, after all these years, is on its way to EU membership. What are your thoughts on that, Terrell? And how hilarious is that?
Well, listen, I think Hungary is the petulant child in the European Union, and Brussels really is tied in knots about how to adequately deal with him, because the whole purpose of expanding into the East was that they would coalesce around this tradition of European values and that we would be a bulwark against Putin and Russia, whereas Orban, who ironically was not a Putin fanboy when he was in the opposition going back into 2007, and remember in 2008, he spoke out against the Russian invasion of Georgia, right? And so he wasn't a fanboy. That's the biggest irony of all this. But then as he got into power and became prime minister, then he started to change. And a lot of people don't really understand what game he ultimately is playing. But what the European Union is doing right now, I think they're strategizing because this is relatively unprecedented. And so keep in mind that within this past year, the European Union has used a particular article in their constitution to withhold funds against Poland, for example, and Hungary, and under the premise that it was against human rights and things like not reforming the judiciary in a meaningful way. And it's a rarely used article within their constitution. And so what is continuing to happen right now with Viktor Orban is that the EU is playing these high school games almost because they're dealing with a child, essentially, in Orban. And so how this is really damaging Ukraine is that he's almost operating in the same sense that Putin is operating, because he understands that Western aid is being held up because of the political friction with the U.S. GOP House, which is essentially bastardizing Ukraine's foreign policy and military needs for their white nationalist campaign talking points for 2024. You have to remember that Viktor Orban, like the right-wing fringe of the Republican Party here in the United States, is a nationalist. He is a racist. He went on a racist tirade against Hungarian speakers, I believe it was in Romania, right? Talking about the mixing of the races there. And so you're dealing with a white nationalist who understands the power of autocracy. And so my theory, because a lot of people are still figuring out why is he doing this, I think that it's a simple matter of him wanting to maintain his power. And if the authoritarian route is the way to do that, then why not do it? I don't see any other issue than that, because he was not speaking in these pro-Putin terms when he was in the opposition. I just think it's a lot simpler than people are trying to intellectualize his descent from Brussels to be.
Exactly right. He's just a king. He's another wannabe king to live above the law. He's purged the opposition. He's used the legal mechanisms of the state to audit his critics, to go after his critics, to use legal warfare. He's ramped up all sorts of bot farm disinformation and state-funded propaganda. He's employed the dark arts of extreme gerrymandering. And all of that has made it very difficult for even a united opposition coalition against him to get him out. So it's a lot of like the Jim Crow South strategies that the Republican forces are pushing through today in so-called red states and so on. Like that's why they love Orban, because he's using the same sort of tyranny of the minority against his own people. That's why they're united with CPAC and Tucker Carlson fawning over him with interviews over there and so on.
What we are not realizing here is that Orban in himself he is a white nationalist, and we don't use these terms, and we need to. And so why is he doing that? Because he understands the power of it. He saw it in France. He saw a lot of the white nationalist parties across Western Europe gaining traction. And so first we have to recognize that he was this person generally all along. We have to make that conclusion. But you can be a white nationalist leader and reap the benefits of the prosperity of the European Union. So he wants his cake and eat it too. And so he also speaks out against NATO, against its being a threat to Europe's security. Ironically, when Hungary was a member of the Warsaw Pact, it was actually invaded by the Soviet Union. Same thing that happened with Prague Spring. That's the biggest irony of it. And so he is supporting a leadership in Moscow that even under its own security umbrella, attack them. And if I, as some black dude that's in Brooklyn talking from my flat, can understand the hypocrisy in this, he does too. But he's being strategic about how he responds to this. But one more point I'll add is that, and this is coming from a foreign policy article, as far as one of the reasons why Orban is being so pro-Putin. And one of those reasons is that he wants to protect Hungarian assets in Russia. And those are linked to this group, MOL Group. And it's the country's leading oil and gas company, and also the OTP Bank. And they're all run by wealthy Hungarians, and they're sympathetic to Orban's party. So another point that this article brings up is that when the French car manufacturer Renault departed from Russia, it had to sell its holdings in the Russian car company for a symbolic and worthless 1 ruble. And so one of the reasons why Orban may be acting this way is that he wants to protect the Hungarian assets in Ukraine and protect the interests of his wealthy business friends in Hungary. So there's a financial component to this as well, which again, in my belief, is tethered to his maintaining and holding power. But what the European Union is starting to see is that their financial greed, which quite frankly is one of the reasons why Ukraine is still having the issues that it is, because the European Union is not really doing its best to untangle the kleptocratic relationship that it has with Russia. Orban realizes this. So until we really deal with the moral consistency of foreign policy, that means that the European Union, including the United States, have to disentangle themselves from these financial interests that undermine the moral integrity of supporting a country like Ukraine. And then in our other episode, when we were talking about Gaza and Israel, all of these vested interests are intertwined, and it's actually harming the very real policy that we really want to pursue in order to support a country like Ukraine. And they're single-handedly allowing Orban to hold them captive. And it's going to be interesting to see in late January or early February, when the European Union comes together to talk about an aid package for Ukraine, if they have the integrity and if they have the guts to actually tell Orban to go fuck himself. If you don't like the European Union, if you do not like the benefits of being a part of our body, then leave. Let's see how many people want to do Brexit 2.0 in Hungary. Let's see how devoted Putin is to you. Then will he be a better partner? If I were a leader in the European Union, I would be fed up with him. And I want to see how fed up they're going to be in the next upcoming months, because that's really going to show how much they really value the strength and the continuity of the union that they're trying to build. Because it's one thing to have 27 members and bringing on several more. It's like already herding cats. And so you're bringing in this other person who doesn't necessarily even consider himself to be a part of the group. And so it'll be interesting to see how far that they're willing to let Orban take them. And I think for their own security, I think time is of the essence, but we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Along with the rest of the world, I wish there was audio of this extraordinarily intriguing moment. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Zelensky, with his historic level of swagger, confronts Viktor Orban at Javier Milei's inauguration. So the new flamboyant president of Argentina, world leaders show up, they put in their FaceTime, right? they have to be diplomatic and arrive to this big inaugural event. And these global ceremonies are obviously opportunity to get some business done. So this new president of Argentina, as ridiculous as he is, and I've talked about his whole list of ridiculousness. You can go back to a previous episode. I can link to in the show notes. But one thing that stands out about him, and this is not an endorsement of him whatsoever, he's staunchly anti-Russian. And so what his handlers obviously did here at his own inauguration, they sat Zelensky right next to Orban. They sat them together. Anybody who has ever gotten married and had to do a seating chart for a wedding or hosted Thanksgiving, you know how fraught these seating arrangements can be. And so Zelensky, I wouldn't be surprised if Zelensky put in a request to be seated next to Orban, and Orban, had no choice but to deal with it. And he looked cornered. Orban, the tough guy. Orban, the wannabe strongman. These strongmen are inherently weak.
They are. But Andrea, you really have to break down, for a lot of people who don't know, I know your listeners do, but just we pay attention to Zelensky more so than anybody. He is someone who is a master of symbolism and visuals. He is one of the best to ever do it. We can say a lot about his decision-making, his political leadership. There's a lot of internal stuff that's going on in Ukraine right now that's in the weeds that we're not going to dig into. But one of the things that he is a master of is the camera, primarily because of his prior career as an entertainer. He is the greatest at it. That is one of the main reasons why he is able to garner so much international support. So that is a part of his diplomacy that he's masterful at. And I think that very few politicians can do. I'll also say that what he's doing right now, the bilateral political diplomacy that he has to engage in, is some of the most difficult that I have ever seen. So a country like Ukraine that prior to February 2002 had marginal status on the international stage, that was propped up by this war because of the genocide and all these other things that are happening, for him to lead his country diplomatically through that and to garner this support is not only just a miracle, but we have to speak to his skill in the art of performance, right? And I think that when we talk about performance, we tend to belittle it to say that it's not a real skill. Yes, it is. Because most of the world doesn't give a federal fuck about the inner politics of Ukraine. Let's just be direct. Even the people who are sympathetic to Ukraine don't care about these things in the way that we care about them. What they do care about is how they feel about it. And Zelensky is a master of tapping into your feelings. And so this Argentine president and all these other people with Benjamin Netanyahu, the statesmanship that he has to really navigate is extraordinarily difficult. And we just have to give him credit for that. And we have to attribute his skill as an entertainer, which is a very real skill that has proven to be central to this, because I don't think any other president would be able to do this, because we're talking about it. Even just us talking about Orban, what was he saying? What was he communicating about? I think it was very strategic that he placed themselves close to him so that they could have that moment. I think that I'm not going to say a stage, I think it was strategically, I think he strategically put himself in that position because he knew that the cameras are going to be there. And if I were him, I would do the same thing. But even if I was his advisors, you just could not put everyone in that moment because they would not leverage it. And so we're all talking about what was said and we're all guessing what was said, but it's because of the statesmanship through the art of presenting yourself on camera and using social media that's evoking this intrigue about what could be said. Because for the past 2 years, he's been doing this. And I think that someone like Biden, if Biden were able to take a tenth of Zelensky's skill to communicate, then I think that we would be a lot better off in galvanizing the rest of the American public, not only around Ukraine, but Israel as well. And the last few presidents that have been able to have that type of gravitas, they were Obama, it was Clinton, it was Reagan. We don't mess with Reagan, but we have to give Reagan his props. He was very good with symbolism, one of the best to ever do it, even though his policy was crappy, he was racist and all that, right? We get all that, right? But beyond that, like there is not a lot of presidents in our history that have been able to have that type of presence as Zelensky. And I just want to give him his props for that.
Oh, without question. And what was he pushing Orban on? Well, he was street fighting. Like Zelensky comes from a background of coming up in Ukraine during the car bomb 1990s. He's somebody who works out religiously. He's got the testosterone pumping through his veins. He's a street fighter. And not only that, he's a comic. So he's done his share of like heckling back at the audience, touring all over the Russian-speaking world and so on. So he's a street fighter through and through. He was bringing that street fighting to Orban who hides behind a moat of corruption and terrorist tactics. And Orban looked like caught flat-footed. Orban looked genuinely scared. And so Zelensky was politely, if that's sort of a word to put a spin on it, getting in Orban's face in a beautiful way.
Who else? He needs that. I mean, who else? Somebody needs to tell you to go fuck yourself, right?
That's what Zelensky did before the eyes of the world. Yeah.
Because nothing else is going to change this man, right? He is operating completely out of the scope of the integrity of the European Union. And what the European Union members did was, okay, go get coffee. And so they snuck it. And so, whereas Zelensky, he said it to his face, right? That's some of the most gangster shit ever. But that's what he needs because he's not going to change. And to be quite frank with you, I want to pull his card. So let's pull his card. Let's see if Orban, one, is going to say, you know what? Fuck it. If you don't want to be a part of our crew, go hang out in Russia. Let's see how you like that, right? Because I don't see, unless there is a change in political leadership, I don't necessarily see Orban change. They need to play a bigger sense of hardball with him because he's going against the rules. And one more thing is that prior to Zelensky doing this, I haven't seen anyone really stand up to him from the European Union, anybody with any power and authority in any real meaningful way. And it was an Eastern European talking to another Eastern European, a former Warsaw Pact country, right? So that I think that was also very important. And so what you see right now are people from Poland, people from the Baltic states, for example, people who are formerly colonized in some way or another under the Soviet Union or under threat under the Russian Federation, really taking the charge in this. And so I think it was quote unquote one of his own confronting him. And I think that type of energy is the type of energy that you're going to see more of from these countries that are actually asserting more of their power within the large European Union and in NATO, because these Eastern European countries were considered the stepchildren. It's like, you're a part of the family, but you really ain't one of us. And so these Eastern European countries are saying, you know what? We aren't anymore, because if it wasn't for us being a buffer, the Russians would be sending their tanks into your territory, right? And that is the belief. And so they're starting to see their agency in these conversations. And I think that for NATO and the rest of the alliance, that's actually a very good thing.
And I just want to provide some historical context for our listeners about how significant this face-off was between Zelensky. And it's really a one-sided face-off, right? Zelensky getting in Orban's face, rightfully so. Dorothy Thompson, who I'm writing a screenplay about, Dorothy Thompson, who covered the rise of Hitler, who covered Mussolini and Stalin, she would call them the little men, the little men. Dorothy Thompson, she crashed the Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden, bringing together over 20,000 American Nazis. And she was heckling these fools and saying, you little men, you little men. And that's what we saw here with Orban, the little man. And like Zelensky's like shorter than him.
Right.
And Zelensky just seemed like a giant staring down at like a shivering Orban. It was a beautiful sight to behold. And what he was getting in Orban's face about was, why don't you want us in the EU? Why don't you want us in the EU? And I want everyone to just stop and just celebrate this moment, because the way the world fell upside down in the first place is because Ukrainians, anytime they were given a chance to have a referendum, to have the people's voice heard, they consistently, again and again and again, voted for greater Western integration, voted to join the democracy world of the West. Even when Yanukovych got voted in, that was thanks to Paul Manafort packaging Yanukovych as some like pro-NATO, but on Ukraine's terms, polished politician. That was revolutionary for Ukrainian politics, what Paul Manafort brought to Ukraine. I don't think people fully realize that. And as president, Yanukovych just went full Trump and was grifting with his family, just stealing from the state budget and enriching himself and so on. And when Donald Tusk, who's now back at the helm of Poland after all these years of rising autocracy in Poland, Donald Tusk was the leader of Poland back then, and he led the effort inside the EU. I think Donald Tusk was actually an EU leader, an EU-wide leader at the time, and he led the effort to get Ukraine set up with the largely symbolic European Union Association Agreement, basically saying, sign this, Ukraine, meet these reforms, meet these standards across your government and business and so on, and then we'll talk about you joining the EU. Yanukovych was supposed to sign this. In the final hour, he took a massive bribe from Putin and did not sign it. Students came out to the square, civic society, journalists came out to the square to protest, saying, we want to be in the EU. And then Yanukovych responds by linking forces with Russian intelligence, Russian FSB militias and so on, and just firing and beating on these pro-democracy protesters. And that leads to a massive, bloody, fiery uprising in the heart of Kyiv that ultimately is successful and spooks little man Yanukovych out to Russia, where he's been ever since. And you and I met during the background of this really seismic event. And then Putin and Russia responds by then launching an invasion of Ukraine, first seizing Crimea, then invading the East. And that's where they've been ever since for 10 years now. And so the fact that after all of these Ukrainians, a significant number of them young Ukrainians, giving their lives to finally have the dream of their grandparents to live in a free, liberated democracy, to be a Western nation, that's how significant these events are.
They are.
And Zelensky was standing up for generations of sacrifice, especially this youngest generation that has given so much. As much as we're laughing about this, because it's hilarious, it is hilarious because the dynamics here, and to see Orban so scared, it's hilarious. We love it. The monumental meaning behind what's happening right now cannot be overstated.